I can't quite place when the first few stars started dying out. It wasn't noticeable at first. At least not from the light-polluted suburbs of Washington, where stars were already barely noticeable grains of salt sparsely speckled throughout the dark night sky. I never thought anything about them was off. Those fiery spheres of light residing millions of light years away from my family's home, until my father brought it up at dinner one night. I was inhaling baked potatoes by the whole when I looked up to see him flipping through his folder, ruffling through copies of diagrams and star systems and formulas that gave me headaches just looking at them. My dad was an astrophysicist. He worked as a researcher at the National Lab, and that often meant long and tiring shifts. Some nights he'd become so glued to his work that he wouldn't come home until it was well past midnight, and I'd hear him go right to bed minutes after coming through the front door without even brushing his teeth or changing out of his work clothes. Other nights when he had no work, he'd go out into the front yard and set up his home telescope. Those nights were the best. I'd sit with him while he peered through the lens with his eyebrows scrunched in concentration. He'd play with the knobs and gears while pointing the telescope in different directions in the sky, and whenever he saw something he liked, he'd always beckon me over and peer into the lens after him. I'd stare in awe at the speckled gray surface of the moon, the great red spot on Jupiter, and Saturn's adornment of rings. My dad also showed me the more distant stars and galaxies, despite his telescope not being advanced enough to pick up on all the details. Nonetheless, I always loved the feeling of being able to see the wonders of space for myself. Josie, my father, said, the first time he spoke since we started eating, he was still staring down at his papers. Look at this. He slid over 2 sheets of paper. I took a look at the 2 images, both taken from his telescope, and could see that both contained a cluster of bright light in the center. Both pictures of the Sombrero Galaxy, he continued, taken 5 months apart, 29 million light years away. Do you notice anything? I examined the papers a bit more closely. The pictures were printed in black and white and relatively grainy, but I could still see it. The one labeled looks a bit dimmer, I responded tentatively, half expecting my dad to start laughing at my incredulous response. Instead, he nodded silently, his gaze lingering upon his plate of untouched food. His response worrying me was an understatement. At best, he was never this grave. Sliding me another 2 sheets of paper, I was once again asked to compare the 2. This time it was 2 pictures, both labeled Messier 31, which was a galaxy 2.5 million light years away from us. The Andromeda, I said, immediately recognizing the celestial body from the countless times I've gazed up at it through the telescope. It looks the same to me, but... And then I saw it. Not the galaxy itself, but the surrounding stars in the background. In the older picture, labeled January 22nd, I could see an array of bright dots speckled throughout the distance. In the more recent one from May, however, I noticed that there was only darkness in the background. I didn't even have to finish my sentence. The silence lingered between my father and me, sharp and clear. My father had discovered something very wrong. In the following days, I tried to continue with life as normal. Every day I went to school, came home, did homework, went to bed, and did the same the very next day. My father, on the other hand, started to spend even more time at his lab. Sometimes he'd be at work for days straight, leaving me home alone with nothing to do but mull in my thoughts. One night, with me alone by myself and nothing better to do, I decided to try looking through my dad's telescope. It took me a good few hours to finally fit all the pieces together and mess with the settings, but eventually I figured it out and could start pointing it in different directions in the sky. I started off trying to find Messier 104, or the Sombrero. I knew the galaxy was located near the borders of the constellations Virgo and Corvus, and I found those with relative ease. But I just couldn't find the Sombrero. It was as if it had been wiped clean off the surface of the night sky. Unnerved, I moved on to the Andromeda, which I easily located near the Great Square of Pegasus. The telescope was nothing fancy, so I couldn't make out any small details with it, but I zoomed in as far as I could and just stared at the little sparkle of light. It vanished. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, the light vanished. It was as if some celestial being had exhaled a bit too harshly, and thus caused the stars to go out like flames on a candle. There was no rational explanation I could think of. I swiveled the telescope due north now, desperately searching for another star. Omega Centauri, a cluster of stars, 17,000 light-years away, is much closer to Earth than either galaxies. I stared at it, while holding my breath, fearing for the worst. I counted. 1. It was still there. 2. The stars looked like millions of shards of broken glass. 3. I wondered if those stars had their own solar systems. 4. Were there aliens living on those planets? 5. In horror, I watched as a black cosmic mass quickly engulfed the sphere of twinkling lights. I couldn't describe it. It looked as if darkness itself had gained mass and was now determined to spread to every corner of the universe. Stifling a scream, I fell backward onto the damp grass behind me. I had seen enough. Without even packing up the telescope, I hopped in my car and started the drive to my dad's workplace. The higher-ups know. I was sitting across from my dad in his cluttered office now, surrounded by screens and whiteboards and textbooks. His messy desk lay between us, its surface practically covered by books and folders. All the researchers here know about it. The government has been informed. Then why haven't they told us about it? Why doesn't the entire city know? Why doesn't the world? I was half shouting by now. Everyone's going on with their lives, oblivious to the fact that everything in the universe is disappearing. And we're going to be next. My dad simply sighed and placed his head into his hands. There's no point in telling the population. We're all going to be gone within the next few days anyway. So what's the point in causing mass panic with no solution in sight? Josie, he continued, you know about the big crunch theory, right? Kind of, I responded stiffly, terrified yet curious. It's the idea that whatever force which facilitates the growth of the universe will eventually stop, thus causing space and time to double back on itself. Basically, the universe starts compressing itself. He paused for a while, as if not sure how to continue. I wanted him to keep going. But this is different. He started up again. Instead of matter being pushed back, it's instead being consumed. No one here can figure it out. It's as if as the edge of the universe is pushing in on us, it's devouring galaxies whole as it moves. It violates everything we know about modern-day physics. Abruptly modern day up from his seat and looked me in the eye. I saw a wave of fear and sadness take over his expression. And I suddenly realized how tired and stressed he must have been these past few days, trying to figure out this phenomenon that was well beyond the scope of the human mind. Come with me, he said. There's something I have to show you. I followed him as he went out through his office, past blank white hallways, down flights of stairs, and through multiple security doors. His workplace was big, I noticed, and most of it seemed empty. I assumed most of the other workers went home to spend their final days with their clueless and blissful families. Finally, we arrived at an iron trapdoor set into the concrete floor. Upon opening it, I could see it was some sort of bunker. Neon panels of fluorescent light adorned the ceiling and illuminated the space with a dim glow. The walls were complete slabs of concrete, along with the floor. Wires ran along the cold surface of the floor like worms on the sidewalk after a rainstorm. The air was filled with the droning sound of buzzing machinery. In the center of the room stood a metal box. It was maybe the size of a small telephone booth with hundreds of wires running into it. After walking closer, I could see that there was a door that led inside, which stood slightly ajar. LED lights flashed from multiple panels all over its interior. You built this in the past week. I turned to stare at my dad, incredulous. He smiled an expression that looked more sorrowful than happy and shook his head. I've been working on this since I started working here 10 years ago. I just spent the last few days finishing it up. Ever since I've learned about Einstein's theory of the multiverse, he continued, I've been determined to prove it. I haven't had time to test this out yet, but it's supposed to transport matter into parallel universes through wormholes by compressing matter into. He stopped suddenly. I watched as he walked up to me and firmly clasped his arms around my shoulders into a hug. The shoulder of my shirt was damp, I realized. He was crying. I'll miss you, Josie, he choked out. Then he let out a weak bark of laughter. Who knew my side project was going to come into use one day? What do you mean? I asked, now starting to tear up myself. Are you going to send me away? Aren't you coming with me? It's too risky. The more matter the machine has to transport, the more unstable it becomes. It's safer if it's just you. You have to live on. You have to warn the others. Who knows if this situation is limited to just our time frame? Before I could protest, he led me to the booth. I love you, Josie. Don't forget me. Those were his last words before he shoved me in and closed the door. I felt everything go dark, and then I was falling. When I woke up, I was in my bed. Except my bed was on the wrong side of the room, and my walls were blue instead of purple. I turned to look around and spied the window. Quickly, I shot out from under my covers and yanked open my curtains. Sunlight streamed in through the glass. Sunlight. The sun was still here. I heard a knock on my door. "Come in," I tentatively responded. As the door opened and the visitor came in, I saw that it was a woman. I immediately recognized her as my mother through my memories, even though I never remembered living through those memories. In my old life, my mother had left us when I was 5. She took one look at me and knew. "You also had to leave, right?" I work as a receptionist at a hospital. A very strange woman walked in one night. If she asks you this one question, always answer no. What a pleasant way to begin my 3 a.m. shift at Mercy Hospital. The first thing I did as I sat down was cut my finger. It was a paper cut. And despite working at one of the largest hospitals in the state, I couldn't find a single Band-Aid laying around. I sucked on my index finger like a vampire while I scrambled my desk for that Band-Aid. I found one purple. I'm a hospital receptionist, and all that means is I greet visitors, make appointments, and look nice. Well, as nice as a 30-year-old man who hasn't slept in hours can look. That night, as we call it, it was just me and a few nurses on the floor. Other than that, it was ghost quiet. Except for the heavy, heavy rain. I sat back on the cheap recliner chair all receptionists get the honor of using. While adjusting my Band-Aid, I listened to the television mounted on the corner of the wall, as it broadcasted a seemingly important message. Authorities say the woman was last seen on Cedar Avenue. I looked up to see if the television was showing any images of this strange woman. None. It was yet another crazy person with no name and no face who we were supposed to look out for. Not creepy at all. Authorities also say the woman was reportedly walking around and asking people very, very bizarre questions. I focused back on my desk and continued working, but still listened as the news anchor went on and on. She continued. The following statement was issued by an unidentified government official. Listen carefully, folks. Whatever she asks you, answer no. Do not, under any circumstances, answer yes. Officials won't comment further as to why, citing security clearance. Police are asking that you immediately call 911 if you deem anyone suspicious. I thought that part of the coverage was quite odd, but I wasn't sure anything could scare me anymore. Working here at the hospital, I thought I had seen it all. At the flash of the ruby red ambulance lights, I've seen people come in with severed arms, legs, and fingers, people who somehow managed to scoop out their eyes, failed suicide attempts, and much, much more. You get used to it. My head was practically sunk into my desk as I filled out paperwork. That's when I heard something very subtle initially. I heard it coming from the front doors, the entrance. The automatic doors opened and closed, slamming against each other, and sounding an obnoxiously loud thud each time. The very dim lighting I had surrounding my desk flickered incessantly. "Hello," I called out, seated behind the safety of my desk. Only the whistling wind responded. "Hello," I called out again. I felt obligated to check if someone was there, especially since it might have been someone who was injured and needed our attention. I reluctantly picked myself up from my chair and walked over to inspect. I nearly slipped and cracked my head open as the entrance floor was almost flooded from the rain. I noticed footsteps and wet shoe marks that seemed to come inside the hospital and then back out. I stood near the doors, poking my head outside, and looked. All I heard were the distant sounds of sirens and honking cars. The rain poured harder. The peace and quiet were disturbed within moments of me sitting back down. The automatic doors started again, opening and closing, slamming shut, and letting in more rain as they did. But this time I heard gentle footsteps make their way towards me, tapping closer and closer. Someone slowly emerged from the darkness between the entrance and the front desk. A woman with drenched black hair approached, wearing a dark brown raincoat and a pair of boots that were too large for her toothpick legs. Her face was inundated with wrinkles and wet makeup, her black eyeshadow smudged. Despite the heavy rain outside, she didn't seem to have bothered wearing her hoodie. "Hello. How can I help you, ma'am?" She didn't respond. She looked around, scanning and observing an unimpressive hospital. "Is there something I can help you with?" Still nothing. We engaged in a brief stare down, which she won. I looked down and pretended to gather important paperwork. "Are you here to visit someone?" Then finally she responded, without talking. She simply nodded and then took a few steps forward, her hands hanging down her side. Her posture was unnatural, almost uncomfortable. "Okay, for now, I need you to sign here. Then you'll have to wait a few hours for visiting time to begin," I said, pushing forward a sheet of paper and pen. She raised her arm to sign and then abruptly stopped. She seemed startled by something on the desk. She looked at me, tilted her head, and, with a smile that was as wide as her eyes, said, "Would you please move that for me?" I was confused at first, and then she pointed at it with her index finger, as drops of rainwater tapped against my desk while her arm hovered over it. I took the little crucifix we had on the front desk and put it in a drawer. The woman proceeded, as if she was going to finally sign the paper, and then stopped before writing anything. She dropped the pen on the ground and stood there again, staring at me. She asked me a question. "Do you reject the Trinity?" "I'm sorry," I replied. For a few more uncomfortable moments, the woman stood there like an ancient statue. I had no idea what she meant by the question. "Ma'am, who exactly are you here to see?" "Family friend. What's your relationship with the patient?" Before I could finish talking, midway through my question, the woman turned around and walked out the door, still smiling, and her eyes as wide as I'd ever seen on a person. I went back to work and tried to move on, but her creepy mannerisms were trapped in my mind throughout the night. At around 4 a.m., I spotted one of the children in our hospital walking down the hallway. "Nina, is that you?" I called out. All the kids in the hospital knew me. I was proudly considered one of the cooler employees. I let them break the rules, brought them snacks upstairs, and even told them scary stories, despite their predictable regret later on. The nurses would get angry with me every time I held one of my scary story nights. They always had a bunch of bed sheets to change the next morning. I only did these things for the kids when I wasn't busy, when it was a quiet night. And this was one of those uneventful nights, which of course was a good thing. Anyway, it was very odd to see Nina awake at that time, walking down those shadowy halls. She was absolutely terrified of the dark, and yet there she was. "Nina, is that you?" I squinted my eyes as I walked towards her. "Sorry, Matt," she began. "I don't want to be there anymore." She had dragged her blue blanket along with her, which was her way of gesturing to the staff that she wanted to move to another room. "The other kids bothering you again?" I asked. I took hold of her hand and began walking her back to the elevator. "Matt, please don't make me go back up there. I don't like the new nurse." I stopped walking. What I said, kneeling to Nina's level. "She keeps asking us the same question over and over." I said no so many times. I kept telling her no, but everyone else kept laughing with her and saying yes to her. "Please, I don't want to go back up there." Nina's words immediately played flashbacks inside my tired, overworked mind. Something about a strange woman going around and asking even stranger questions. I didn't pay enough attention to that broadcast to notice the woman, but even if I had, I thought she had left the hospital. I ditched the elevator and ran up a flight of daunting stairs, stomping against each step with all the force I could muster. I probably woke up all those sleeping employees. I was so loud. I opened the door to the children's room and couldn't believe my eyes. I checked each room, each one on each floor. I woke up my coworker and asked about the children. She couldn't find them either. We looked everywhere and put the hospital on lockdown. We set off all possible alarms and other emergency procedures. We didn't find them. They just disappeared. I'm a volunteer archivist, and I just found a creepy file. Actually, archivist is a little bit of a reach. I volunteer at my local historical society. Specifically, I transcribe recordings and retype documents that are in poor shape. I initially volunteered in order to access history and folklore records that aren't available anywhere else. A couple of weeks ago, I found a tape-recorded interview conducted by a graduate student. The subject was an elderly gentleman named Terrence. While Terrence has passed, his family still lives here in town. They gave me permission to share this story but asked that I withhold information like Terrence's surname, the town name, and the interview date. After consulting with Terrence's descendants, I decided not to correct his grammar or syntax. The interview can be a little hard to read at times because of this, but I think it's pretty easy to get used to. I'd like to note 3 things first. This piece involves fairly detailed descriptions of the deaths of a rabbit and a dog. Second, Terrence's repeated use of the word Kodak. Kodak used to be a catch-all term for cameras in my area, and in fact I know a few elderly people who still refer to all cameras as Kodaks. Third, Terrence repeats a variation of "I do not understand myself" several times. The phrase is patterned on a ritual prayer that Terrence learned growing up. I obviously don't know if it's true, but it's an official part of my city's historical record. And in any case, judging by the emotion expressed in the recording, Terrence believed it. So, without further ado, Terrence's interview. Boy. My grandfather, who was a good photographer early in his life, owned many Kodaks. He got rid of most, but held back one that my daddy found in his home after he died. My daddy thought it might be worth something. It wasn't. It was broken and had earwigs inside it. My daddy had no use for the thing and made to toss it away, but I asked him to keep it. He allowed me this, and I fixed it up slowly. When it was fixed, I carried it with me all around the place. The film cost money, but my daddy did well for himself, so when I did my chores well, he would buy me 2 rolls each month. I had a dog named Tusky, a piebald Staffordshire Bull Terrier. Didn't have to pay for him as a pup because his lower jaw was wrong and stuck out too far. His teeth break sometimes and hurt him sometimes. On his bad days, I would feed him by hand. He grew up too big, twice as big as the other bulls I saw. He was a good dog, though. I trained him right. He never hurt anybody. Was too good for his own good. Couldn't be a guard dog. Too friendly. Companion. Not a work dog. For this, my daddy didn't like him much. I liked to take pictures with the Kodak. I taught Tusky to pose really well. I took many pictures of him. He looked funny with his stuck-out jaw and his little ears forward. Even though he looked funny, I told him always that he looked handsome. He stood up straighter when I told him this, so I knew he could tell I was giving him compliments. I loved that dog. One day he killed a rabbit. It wasn't a clean death, because his teeth were all wrong, and the jaw did not allow a good grip. So he did not break the neck or the back of the rabbit. I heard it screaming. Rabbit screams are bad business. I was a young boy at the time, so I cried for it. I tried to make Tusky drop the rabbit. He bit my arm not too badly, for his jaw could not close properly, so I kicked him. He dropped the rabbit, and it was still screaming at me. I stamped its head. The first time did not do much. I had to stamp a second time for the rabbit to die. I do not understand myself. I was scared and sad, and very mad at Tusky. Pictures should not have been on my mind, but they were. I took pictures of the rabbit. After a bit, the rabbit began to scream again. Tusky lost his mind and attacked it again, tearing one of the ears off before I could call him off. Then the rabbit dragged itself up, crushed its head, broke legs all dangling behind it, and tried to crawl away. I do not like to kill things, but it would be cruel to let that animal drag off and die slowly, so I took a rock and smashed him once and for all. I leave it in a lightning tree and go home. I do not understand why I do the things I do. I did not think back then. I did not think. I felt disturbed. I kept thinking of the rabbit. I wonder if I brought it back with the Kodak. Not good things for a church boy, but I could not stop. So I take the Kodak again, and one of my daddy's lanterns, and I go back to the lightning tree. The rabbit is where I left it. That strikes me strange. We have dogs, owls, bobcats, barn cats, and catamounts. That rabbit should be gone and eaten by one, but he remained there bloody and broken. I took another picture of him. He starts to scream. I don't know how. His head was crushed by my stamping in the rock. I see one eye in his teeth. The rest is flat and I see ants crawling through him. He gets up with some difficulty. Then he sees me with his one eye and hops at me. He slid his teeth into my finger hang skew, for his head was too flat to close his teeth properly. He did not let go. He seems angry. I smash him into the lightning tree and kill him a third time. Then I bury him and go back home. My mama was angry with me and whooped me. Then she dressed the bite and sent me to bed. I told her it was Cricket, our barn cat, so she would not know what I did. I put the Kodak away and took no pictures for a full season. My daddy still gave me the 2 film rolls each month, but I hid them away. One morning in the autumn, my parents were out. I was by myself at home. Tusky chases Cricket across the road and gets hit by a car. It flips him up and under the wheels, taking the skin from his ribs and throwing him back to our easement. He tumbles down to our yard. I do not understand myself now or then. I get the Kodak and put the new film in, then I bring it outside to take pictures of my good dog. No sooner did I snap the picture than Tusky rolled his head and howled. Tusky, I try to say, only I was crying my heart out. You a good boy, you be okay. Tusky turns his head. His neck was broken, so it was all funny. Then he sees me and tries to crawl. He whines and howls when his ribs scrape the rocks. I went to him, but it was a bad idea. He growls and snaps at me. At first, I think it is because he is in such pain. But that isn't true. My good boy had brown eyes before he died. But after I take the picture, one eye becomes green, hot white green like in the lightning storms. Then Tusky bites me hard and he won't let go. He tried to shake, but with his neck broke could not. He just digs his teeth in harder. My daddy and my mother came back then. My daddy got his gun and shot Tusky. I did not take any more pictures. I have my daddy take me to see the trains one day, and I leave the Kodak on the tracks for a train to smash. That is the last I see or hear of that Kodak. I apologize for crying at you, sir. It's not like me to cry.